you're in calculus. You're an Asian, so you're smart, you're good at math, you're so smart. Like, come help me with this. You don't have to try hard at this. It discourages you. It really is discouraging to hear.
Kind of cherry picking
overall,
the traits that are kind of erasing
the most,
advantageous
entire
stereotypes,
culture,
entire history to apply to a blanket of people, just to put a few labels on there that are
even now in high school, the
to understand
prevalence
and
drives a
easier to
wedge
incorporate.
between those
None of us
certain
want to
minority
be looked
groups
at this way.
because
we all want to be like our own
again,
people
it
and
puts
be more
so
than
much
just,
pressure on
the
people
country we
to
happen to be
either
from.
a lot of times
be in the
I think it is
stereotype
meant as a
or
compliment,
not be in
as
the
in,
stereotype. Like,
you're so smart, you really are this model minority.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Pièce de Resistance, a podcast where we examine social issues through the lens of real stories. I'm Alessandra Ashford. Today, we have two reporters and yearbookers from Western Student Press. Do you want to say hi?
I'm Bella. I'm an Asian American. I'm a junior.
I'm Avi. I'm also an Asian American. I'm a senior.
Today, on our first episode, we are going to be examining the model minority stereotype and how it affects students today. So first, the Wikipedia definition of the model minority stereotype, when you just Google it, it says, the model minority myth is a sociological phenomenon that refers to the stereotype of, as well as data on, certain minority groups, particularly Asian Americans, as successful and well-adjusted, as demonstrating that there is little or no need for social or economic assistance for the same or different minority groups. Okay, so just like first impressions, what do you guys know about or have had experiences with the model minority stereotype?
One of the biggest things about being a South Asian kid is there's this constant assumption that I'm supposed to be very good at computer science and math and anything to do with that. And so even from a young age, a lot of people kind of just instantly assumed that my dream job is an engineer or going into IT, because so many people that look like me happen to be good at those things and go into them. And so being in yearbook, it's a very interesting experience because there's not a lot of South Asians in yearbook, and doing something that's so much more creatively focused kind of goes against everyone else's impression of me, because it's not really CS or math or any of that.
Bella?
My first impression of the model minority myth really going through school is growing up how much I heard, oh, you're an Asian, so you're smart, you're good at math, come help me with this. And the even now in high school, the prevalence of people making those sorts of jokes, saying oh, you're Asian, so you're smart, you don't have to try hard at this, you're good at math. And it can be really discouraging for people who really are not naturally maybe gifted or talented at a certain subject like this. And as well, it puts a lot of pressure on people who might even be good at this, because it's these jokes and these stereotypes are still being reinforced. Every time you say, oh, you're an Asian, so you're good at math, you're smart, it perpetuates a stereotype. And it's not about whether or not the stereotype is positive. It's more so that this is a stereotype that affects people, many people, in negative ways.
Do you feel like other members of both the South Asian and East Asian community have internalized it? Do you feel pressure from your own communities to do well in school?
Personally, I think that I try to distance myself from groups of people in particular who will perpetuate these stereotypes, because it does get really tiring to hear all the time, you're so good at math, you're good at science, you're good at this, you're good at that, because you're Asian. And yes, I do think there's, in my community in particular, I'm Chinese, I feel like there's a very big pressure on kids to succeed, just inherently. And there's such a culture around, especially adults, of really bragging about their kids and telling other adults about how much their kids are doing so good at this and so good at that. And it does put pressure on other people, because you could go under the assumption that, oh, just because my parents don't talk about me to other parents, they don't brag about me, that I'm not as good, or maybe I see that other people are performing better. And it's not true. You can be performing at your best self and be really excelling at something, either objectively or comparatively to other people, and still not be recognized for that. And it is a lot of pressure to constantly be hearing, oh, my kid is so good at choir, my kid is the top math competitor in the state or country or whatever. And hearing those things over and over again reinforces the stereotype that, we're just so quote unquote naturally good at everything. But it is really negative to be hearing those things.
Yeah. Avi, do you want to talk about your experience with that?
Yeah, so one big thing is, so I'm Indian, right?
Mhm.
So like at a lot of family gatherings or gatherings of like family friends, those sort of things where like almost everyone in the room is like we're all from the same place. Um the expectation, like if academics comes up, is that you're doing perfectly or like amazing, and that's the default. Like for example, if you said like, oh, I got 100 on like this calculus test, the reaction of everybody in the room would just be like, oh, okay, that's
Yeah.
normal. And everybody just thinks it's abnormal if you don't perform perfectly at a subject that you're expected to be good at. So like basically anything STEM. And so that expectation kind of just perpetuates like throughout like school, college, if you go to grad school, like your entire life, just being a part of this community, because that's how everybody perceives you. Like if you perform well in school, that's not because you're working harder, because you're smart. It's just because like, oh, you're Indian, that's how it's supposed to be, end of story. Like it's nothing out of the ordinary if you're really good at something.
Yeah. Do either of you ever feel like you struggle with like celebrating your accomplishments because of that?
Personally, I try to adopt a mindset of looking at where I am now compared to where I was before, particularly not necessarily in terms of like literal measurable academic achievements, like getting more hundreds on my math tests, but in terms of how I feel like I'm growing personally, in terms of how I receive information, how I learn. So for me, it's more about trying to objectively recognize the things that I am doing better and being able to count on those. But at the same time, I do think that while it can be difficult to celebrate those sorts of things because they're already expected of you, for me personally, it is important to also not inflate them too much and not celebrate them too much, because that can also put more pressure on myself to say, well, I'm already improving so much. If I don't improve this much, then I'm doing worse. And that's also negative to reinforce. So I think personally, I do think it can make celebrating achievements harder, but at the same time, there is a benefit to recognizing that not every single achievement has to be celebrated. I can just move at my own pace and appreciate how I'm growing and changing.
Yeah, so I think for me, because of like the environment that I've like grown up in, it's definitely much harder for me to celebrate achievements. One pattern I've noticed, which this might be more pronounced in myself, but I know like other people like me definitely share something similar, where it's like any sort of achievement, whether it's like academic or extracurricular, it seems a lot more impressive before you've done it,
Yeah.
and like it's something you're working towards. But then once you've achieved it and it's in the past, it instantly drops to like, oh, that was expected. And then you kind of stop celebrating it, and like you kind of forget all of the work and like how hard it was, and just like, oh, it's just another thing I've done. And now you have to move on to the next like hurdle to cross over. So there's really never any sense that like, oh, it's worth it to like linger on this and like congratulate myself, because like I already got this achievement. There's no point in lingering on it. Just move on to the next one.
Yeah. So I did want to bring up, do you feel like you're like experiencing like the model minority myth, like when you're applying for college, writing those essays, getting all that stuff done?
Definitely.
Yeah.
So I want to do engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the biggest things that's always on my mind when I'm writing my college essays is how can I stand out, but not just stand out as an applicant. It's stand out as yet another South Asian boy applying for engineering,
Mm-hmm.
which there are literally millions of people doing that. So, like my average college application is different from a lot of other people because I'm so focused on like making sure I stand out from like everybody that's from the same demographic, because we're all going for the same major. And so I spend a lot of time thinking like I don't want the admissions officers to see me as just another one of the South Asian kids going for engineering. So there's a lot more pressure on trying to differentiate myself from that.
Yeah. Bella, you're not really applying for college yet, but you're like getting there. Do you have any experience with that? Just like, worrying about standing out?
Yes, I would say I worry about standing out a lot because college admissions, it's really something that we never really want to have to worry about until like senior year, but it is something that kind of stays in the back of your head throughout high school. And for me, I think a lot of that is because I really prefer to do my own thing. I try to carve my own path through my own interests rather than trying to follow a more set path. And I think that can make me feel unique or seem unique in some ways, but at the same time, it does worry me that it feels like I'm not on a specific path. I know so many East Asian kids who start high school and they're immediately in the biomed pathway or the health science pathway, and they go up until practicum or for health science, for example, and it's such a set pathway. It's such a like solidified, oh, I think I'm going to go into being a doctor, or I'm going to go into med school or something like that. And even though that's something I'm passionate about and I really like biology and chemistry, the fact that I was not on these pathways to begin with can sometimes feel like I'm taking a step back and a step out of it, because it's so there's such a pressure on knowing what you want to do from the start of high school. Of course, you don't even have to pick until you're in college choosing your major for a lot of people, but so many people start so early, start when they're 14, 15, know that they're going to go on this path. And for me, trying to combat this myth has really been trying to make sense of my own path and make myself stand out in a way that is like, I don't need to be on this specific path in order to be good at what I do.
I wanted to go back and look and do some research on the origins of the model minority myth. I found this article written by Jeff Gao for The Oregonian. It is in response to an article from the Washington Post titled "The Real Reasons the U.S. Became Less Racist Towards Asian Americans." So this is what he says, quote, "As historian Ellen Wu explains in her book, The Color of Success, the model minority stereotype has a fascinating origin story, one that's tangled up in geopolitics, the Cold War, and the Civil Rights Movement. To combat racism, minorities in the United States have often attempted to portray themselves as upstanding citizens capable of assimilating into mainstream culture. Asian Americans were no different," Wu writes. "Some, like the Chinese, sought respectability by promoting stories about their obedient children and their traditional family values. The Japanese pointed to their wartime service as proof of their shared Americanness. African Americans in the 1940s also made very similar appeals, but in the post-war movement, Wu argues it was only convenient for political leaders to hear the Asian voices. The model minority narrative may have started with Asian Americans, but it was quickly co-opted by white politicians who saw it as a tool to win allies during the Cold War. Discrimination was not a good look on the international stage. Embracing Asian Americans, quote, provided a powerful means for the United States to proclaim itself as a racial democracy and thereby credential to assume leadership of the free world," Wu writes. Stories about Asian American success were turned into propaganda. By the 1960s, anxieties about civil rights movement caused white Americans to further invest in the positive portrayals of Asian Americans. The image of the hardworking Asian became an extremely convenient way to deny the demands of African Americans. As Wu describes in her book, both liberal and conservative politicians pumped up the image of Asian Americans as a way to shift the blame for Black poverty. If Asians could find success within the system, politicians asked, why couldn't African Americans? Okay, thoughts on that?
I agree that a lot of the again, even though a lot of people I hear say like, oh, the model minority myth is not really a big deal, it's a positive thing that we're saying about Asians. Why is such a big deal? I think that it's very, very clear, especially from that excerpt, how much it can affect other people. Because really, a stereotype comes down to whittling a certain demographic of people into one single bucket and to condense them, to basically dehumanize them into a single label. And that can work, in my opinion, in a lot of different ways, even throughout different Asian ethnicities. For example, I think a lot of people or a lot of teenagers nowadays will think of Japan and they'll think of a lot of anime, manga, they'll think of cosplayers. It's really like thinking about the media and the media that Japan outputs, and that can be dehumanizing in the sense that some people will literally objectify Japanese people for that. Same thing with Korea and how big K-pop is as an industry commercially in South Korea. It can become dehumanizing for people to idolize Koreans over and over because of the K-pop industry. And I think those are two major East Asian countries. And I think the way that this myth is perpetuated in Chinese people in particular is also negative, though not in the same way as necessarily Japanese and Korean people, because again, we're seen as these like obedient people. We're seen as so hardworking, pull up by our bootstraps. And I think that while a lot of times people will turn to Japanese and Korean people and objectify them and see them as like only the face of their country as like media, um, a lot of people see Chinese people and think that they're violent or think that they're coming for our jobs, and it still is pushing this model minority myth in that oh, Asians are so good at this. These Japanese people, the face of their country is like anime, or Korean people, the face of their country is K-pop. But then Chinese people, I feel like, can be then dehumanized because um, a lot of Americans will just see Chinese people as these like laborers, these hard workers. And again, it is dehumanizing and it's objectifying to really whittle a group of people down to this one thing. And like, it's interesting to me because even within like major East Asian countries, there is such like a wide range, a wide diaspora of how these people are viewed, and they all do perpetuate um, very similar sentiments within the model minority myth, but they just manifest in different ways. And um, like Ali said, it can hurt Black populations because then people will compare Asian populations to Black populations, and even within Asian populations, can be like you can people will infantilize Japanese people and then think that Chinese people are super aggressive, just as an example. So even within groups, um, this like stereotype I feel like really like pushes very deep.
Yeah. Avi, do you have any thoughts you want to add?
Yeah, so on that article, I think it's very interesting to me.
Yeah.
And a big part of it is also like, I guess this is more focused on South Asians than East. Like, so the article itself, I think, is talking more about East Asians.
Yeah.
So one really interesting difference I see is with South Asians, while there's like some of the similarities with being smart and good at like math and other things, with South Asia, there's also a lot of stereotyping of like being like unclean or like unhygienic, or like the fact that most South Asian dishes are like meant to be eaten with your hands and things like that. So I just think like a big part of all this stereotyping is obviously stereotyping itself is like very harmful, not only to the community that's being stereotyped, but other communities. But also it's like kind of cherry picking the traits that are the most like advantageous to stereotype and the easiest to apply to a blanket of people, and then ignoring a lot of the other nuances and just overall like kind of erasing an entire culture's like entire history just to put like a few labels on there that are easier to understand or like easier to incorporate into your like larger goal.
Yeah, I did want to add there is like a point in the article about how like it was used by like opportunistic politicians to like drive a wedge in between like different minority communities, like different Asian Americans and African Americans. So I did want to ask, like, do either of you ever feel like you struggle to relate to like other people of color because of the minority stereotype?
Yeah, I would say there's definitely like it varies a lot from person to person. Like there's definitely like a lot of struggle because of like that wedge that's been driven, but at the same time, um I think part of it is also like sometimes I feel a sense of like unity with other people because we're all being stereotyped the same way, and we are all trying to break out of that stereotype. So while like on one hand the stereotype is obviously very good at like putting us against each other, there's also like a lot of commonality, and like none of us want to be looked at this way. We all want to be like our own people and be more than just like the country we happen to be from. So there's a lot of like common goal there.
Yeah.
Could you repeat your question?
Okay, so I was saying like how in the article the model minority stereotype was originally used to like drive a wedge between Asian Americans and other minority communities in America. I was wondering, like, do you feel like you struggle to relate to other people of color because of the model minority stereotype?
I think, yeah, to answer your question, yes, I do think that it makes it harder to relate to other minorities. In particular, I think especially because there's such like an almost ingrained culture that I've noticed where people will again crack these jokes. Asians are so good at math. You're so smart. You know, Indians go into like tech support or whatever stupid thing that people like to say. Um, it does pit you against other people because if you're someone who grows up hearing these things, even if you say them as jokes, you're still saying those things. And that really does drive a wedge between the people who are trying to stand out and trying to actively fight against this myth and the people who, while they may be doing their best to stand out and not perpetuate this stereotype, they're still making these jokes and they're still pushing this stereotype. And I think that drives a wedge within communities of Asian people, or even between different like races, ethnicities, because I think it drives a wedge between certain minority groups because again, it like puts so much pressure on people to either be in the stereotype or not be in the stereotype. Like it's almost like again, by having the stereotype, you're trying to separate people into are they following this myth or are they perpetuating this myth or are they trying to stay out of the box and like be a different person? And it makes me feel like set apart from a lot of other kids, especially at school because I hear these jokes so much. Oh, you're in calculus. It's because you're Asian and you're good at math. You're so smart, and it discourages you. It really is discouraging to hear. And a lot of times I think it is meant as a compliment, as in you're so smart. You really are this model minority. But it's discouraging to hear because it does make you feel honestly outcast. It because people are still trying to perpetuate this myth onto you and put this box around you. So I think that in general it drives people apart because it almost causes like infighting, and not infighting in like a literal sense where you're going to argue over it, but in that you're subconsciously pitting yourself or other Asian people against each other or other minority groups against each other by continuously relating to this myth, and that's what drives people apart.
Mm-hmm. I just want to ask, do you guys ever feel like people don't really acknowledge like the discrimination, like the racism that Asian Americans do face?
I think people definitely do like fail to acknowledge it. I think one of the biggest reasons for that is because, like I mentioned earlier, it's seen as a positive stereotype. Mm-hmm. And so usually when you think about racism, it's like, obviously that immediately has a negative connotation, like racism equals having negative thoughts about another group of people. Mm-hmm. So then people might think that stereotyping Asians as being really smart and being like this minority that you should look up to because they're so good at everything is not racism, or like, yeah, it's not racist of you to think that because it's positive. But then I feel that like that's so incorrect because it's still like erasing all of the hard work and like it's kind of just erasing everything about those people that you're still being racist against. Mm-hmm. And so the mass majority of people just don't see it that way. They think like positive thoughts equals not racism. And I think it's so much more complicated than that because at the end of the day, you're still applying one assumption to a bunch of people that you don't know anything about.
No.
Adding on top of what Avi said, again, it comes down to really whittling down someone's identity into like a bucket of their nationality or their ethnicity or their race because they're Asians are so smart. And I think it makes it harder for people to acknowledge the discrimination because I was born in America. I've been raised American my whole life. And that's because my parents really took a huge leap to immigrate from China and settle down and really build their life and build a good life so that I can also have be a step ahead. And people see that, and people see that a lot of these very, very hardworking Asians who come from very, very often poor immigrant backgrounds, they really are able to achieve the so-called American dream, and they're really able to make a living for themselves that is oftentimes better off than their home country. And people see that, and people see the success, the outward success, oftentimes from bragging about their kids' successes, or maybe because you see that they have a Tesla or something like that. And people see that and they forget the hardships that those people went through in the first place to get to those points. They forget the often racism people have to encounter. If you didn't go to an international school in your home country, you probably struggled learning English, or you probably have an accent. And people will oftentimes discriminate against you for those things. And the sort of positive myth of like only looking at the successes of immigrant families, especially from Asia, really does whittle it down, and it reduces the actual accomplishment that is being able to make a life for yourself. And while I do think that being able to settle down successfully and live out this so-called American dream is a lot of that is luck. A lot of that is the chances, the opportunities that you take up along the way. Everyone that I know that has carved out their own slice of the American dream has done that through not only luck, but also hard work. And to really whittle it down to be like, oh, your success is inherent to you because you're Asian, it really, really detracts from the hard work and the physical, mental labor that is put into really trying to succeed and set yourself and your family up for success.
Okay, I wanted to read this article. This is written by a British American journalist. His name is Andrew Sullivan. He wrote this for the New York Times, I'm pretty sure. It's about the 2016 election, but in the very last bit of the article, he talks about how like Asian Americans, mind you, he's white. Okay, I'm gonna read this excerpt. It says, Asian Americans, like Jews, are indeed a problem for the, quote, social justice brigade. I mean, how on earth have both ethnic groups done so well in such a profoundly racist society? I'm so sorry. I mean, how on earth have both ethnic groups done so well in such a profoundly racist society? How have bigoted white people allowed these minorities to do so well, even to the point of earning more on average than whites? Asian Americans, for example, have been subject to some of the most brutal oppression, racial hatred, and open discrimination over the years. In the late 19th century, as most worked in hard labor, they were subject to lynchings and violence across the American West and laws that prohibited their employment. They were banned from immigrating to the U.S. in 1924. Japanese American citizens were forced into internment camps during the Second World War and subject to hideous racist propaganda after Pearl Harbor. Yet today, Asian Americans are among the most prosperous, well-educated, and successful ethnic groups in America. What gives? It couldn't possibly be that they maintained solid two-parent family structures, had social networks that looked after one another, placed enormous emphasis on education and hard work, and thereby turned false negative stereotypes into true positive ones, could it? It couldn't be that all whites are not racist or that the American dream still lives. That is how he ends his article. Mind you, he was writing about the 2016 election. This is his opinion on why he thinks Hillary lost. So, I don't know why he brought this up, but response, I think when I read, I think that was probably one of the most racist things that I had read like all month. Okay, who wants to go first?
First of all, I don't fully understand bringing up Asian Americans in an article like that's analyzing political science.
Yeah.
I don't understand that, but also so many of the statements made in that excerpt kind of just seem like they're purely there to just like once again erase all of the hard work. Like, yes, you can make the argument that maintaining two-person families, having a social structure that takes care of one another, placing emphasis on education, like, I agree that those things are important. But placing those in the context of all Asians do this and that's why they're successful, first of all, not all Asians are successful. Not all of any demographic of people is successful. And so trying to connect those things that just don't go together just doesn't make very much sense, because like I feel that the argument he's making is like, because Asians have this family structure and these social systems of taking care of each other, like we somehow managed to overcome all of the bigoted racism. um that's such like a polarizing stance to take, that completely ignores that every single person is different, and the vast like different environments found across this country, and like just how much more diversity there is. That entire paragraph just seems like he learned one fact about how white people can sometimes be racist against Asians,
Yeah.
and he learned that like there's probably some statistic that says that Asians maybe have lower divorce rates or something.
Mhm.
And then he took these like very these facts that are very singular and can't be generalized, and then proceeded to use those to like make a huge general argument that applies to literally the entire population of the United States.
Yeah, like I feel like it's definitely like I feel like he's like gaslighting other minority groups. I feel like he's like the way he's saying like, oh, white people can't be racist because Asians have positive stereotypes and Asians are doing well and whatever. So actually racism isn't a thing, because if it was a thing, then Asians wouldn't be ever viewed positively.
Yeah. I think as a rebuttal to his to what he said, particularly about what he said about emphasis on education and hard work, I think that while it is true that of course it's really really bad to whittle down a group of people into one thing and say they're all hard workers or they're all smart. Like if you've met one Asian person, you've met one Asian person. You only know that Asian person and you cannot extrapolate anything from that. But I do think it's true that there's cultural setup into how people are raised that does influence how they think. For example, a lot of times the reason that Chinese kids will excel so much at math is because of how we learn our numbers. Our number system is very, very straightforward, whereas you count in English 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you get to 11. That's kind of weird. That's 10 and 1, right? But it's 11 or it's 12. In Chinese, 11 is literally 10, 1. 12 is literally 10, 2. So you grow up learning your numbers and you're already in your head, you're internalizing that math, that 20 is 2 tens, that 40 is 4 tens. And like that's a very, very small cultural difference that the language that teaches you can actually have a significant impact, like a butterfly effect over the course of your life, because it places an emphasis on like subconsciously you're thinking of these things as you're even speaking your language. So small things like that can lead to big effects. So again, while it is completely improper to say that, you know, Asian people are better at math because they're Asian, there are certain aspects to, for example, Chinese culture that can lead you to have these sorts of understandings internally from a young age. And on top of that, and to add on to what Avi said, looking at success stories really only tells us a fraction of everyone's story, because there are as many, if not more, losses or quote unquote failures as there are success stories. I think that a lot of the people who find success in coming to immigrating to America and setting up their life have a lot going for them from a young age. For example, my mother, who comes from rural China, she grew up with a passion and like a lust for learning, but because she grew up from such a like a socioeconomically disadvantaged background, a lot of what she had to learn growing up was not only educational prowess but also street smarts, and that's something that I'm sure has helped her throughout immigrating to America and coming here and making a life for herself, is the cleverness that she picked up, not just from learning maths or science, but also from observing humans and really picking up on those small little subtle things that can make a difference throughout your whole life. And of course, not everyone can, of course, adopt these skills. Just like not everyone is able to learn calculus at the age of 10. Not everyone is going to be able to pick up these other like small skills. So to only look at success stories is really to whittle down an entire population into what you think they're good at. And like coming back to the article, coming back to the article, yes, it is true that Asian Americans and other demographics, minority demographics, were really subject to a lot of tough things. Like the article said, the Japanese internment, and for Chinese people, the ban on immigration. The reason that there are so many success stories is because these people always find a way. People will always find a way to work around these things. Just like, although these people were subject to such hardship, that is something that could have made them more motivated to bypass these hardships and really stand out. Whereas if you have several generations of families in America, it might be, you might seem more, if you have several generations of families in America and you're not, one of your obstacles in settling down and achieving the quote unquote American dream is not to come to America, it might be seen as your starting pad is a lot higher than someone who does actually have to immigrate and go through that system. And because of the hard work that oftentimes you have to go through, because sometimes a lot of immigrant families and people are starting from a lower point in their life, and they do have to work hard or even harder to get to the same point or higher. As that hard work builds up over time, it can come out as being more and more successful over time. So then the success stories that we see are really these people who put so much work and effort into their entire life, into every single step of their life. And that's what we see. And that's why we automatically assume that they're better at these things, is just what we're seeing, how we're seeing them at their present state, and not all the work that led up to it.
Yeah, that was really good. Do you guys feel like, as a whole, like the, people's perception of Asian Americans, or at least like people's attitude toward the model minority stereotype, do you think it's getting better?
I think it's certainly changed. I have a few good examples of this. So one is like when I was a little kid back in like elementary school. Even then, for somehow there was already the assumption that I was going to be the best kid at math. But there were other negative things, like for example, which I know a lot of immigrant kids can relate to, this is being scared to bring like your ethnic food like to school, like for lunch, because everybody would be like, oh, that smells bad, or make fun of you. And now I go to Trader Joe's and I see like frozen Indian dishes there, which I would say that's definitely an improvement. But then on the other side, like just a few months ago, my mom was on the phone with an insurance agent, I think it was, and my mom has been here for like I think 15 or 20 years. She speaks fluent English, and yet the lady on the other side just couldn't understand her, to the point where I had to go and translate, even though me and my mom are both fluent in English. And so like, even though the attitude has gotten better, there's still things like that where I feel like people are just less willing to try. And I mean try very broadly, whether it's try to not assume that someone is only really good at math because they're Asian, or try harder to understand them if they have a bit of an accent because they didn't grow up here, like all sorts of things like that. There's still a lot of unwillingness to even go a little bit out of your shell to just try to understand like another group of people.
Bella?
I would say, yeah, like the one of the biggest parts of this whole issue that it comes down to is even if you have some positive things to say, or like heck, you have some friends that are Asian Americans, that doesn't, being friends with a bunch of Asian kids and then turning around and making a bunch of jokes about how they're all good at math do not cancel out. So I feel like for this to actually go away, like for 20, 30 years down the line, for somebody who's like from the same city in India that I'm from to come here and not feel a bunch of pressure to be really good at math or like go into engineering, there needs to be like a lot more change than just being able to like get Indian food at the grocery store or not be scared of bringing food from my house like to school. It should, and like it needs to get to the point where like I can walk through the hallways and not hear some random person going like talking about how their Asian friend is really good at math.
Mhm.
Like it's both, like Bella said, it's both physical and it's also like cultural and like the way a lot of people just think about Asian Americans.
Yeah. Okay, this is really good. Thank you guys so much for participating. This
Thank you,
is
Allie.
Pièce de Résistance.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. I think that because these myths and these stereotypes were negative for so long, that when the only place that you can go is up in terms of how you are approaching these stereotypes, then there is an improvement, and it's very visible improvement. Like Avi said, a lot of more cultural foods are being introduced. America is considered the melting pot of the world, or the mixing pot, and it's true. So many Asian restaurants all around now. Chinese food is such a staple of takeout in a lot of households. But at the same time, I think that um, while the general population may acknowledge or appreciate these things more, there's still a lot to be said about how people will treat other actual human beings, because you can love Chinese food and still be incessantly racist or push these stereotypes onto Chinese people. And it goes for Indian food too, right? Like you can love Indian food and still, make tech support like jokes, and like those are awful, right? So I think that while it's a good thing that a lot of our cultures are being included more in people's day-to-day lives, it's still important to think about, are we dismissing other negative things because we see more of these like physical manifestations of these cultures in our day-to-day lives? Are we dismissing the racism? Are we dismissing the negative things being said too? So I think while there is like a physical improvement in how we've accepted other minority groups into like American culture, there is still a long way to go in terms of really genuinely accepting people and appreciating people for who they are as people and not as a minority.
Do you have any final thoughts, Avi?
I think Bella sums it up really well.